Hey guys, I hope everybody's doing well. It's time to get learned up. So today we take a look at lesson 4. Lesson 4 is all about imposing liberalism in Canada. Now this will be the last lesson for this unit. So that means we're getting pretty close to the end of the unit here, and you can expect that there will be some unit tests pretty soon. All right. So today we learn about imposing liberalism here in Canada. All right, so you see some images um, here in the video, and you also see some images in your partial notes that are related to Canada's history, Canada's past, uh, times in which European Canadians, white Canadians, made many attempts to assimilate or impose liberalism on Canada's First Nations peoples. Okay, so we're using the word imposing here. So what does the word imposing mean? Well, it means to force something on people, whether they like it or not. So the color for this lesson is red. So you can complete your partial notes with anything that is written in red. Okay, so today we're talking about um, the principles of liberalism, right? The values of liberalism. And that is everything over here on the right side of the ideological spectrum, right? The principles of individualism, they are also the principles of liberalism. Okay, so we're learning about how these principles have been forced upon Canada's Indigenous peoples throughout history. Okay, so let's compare worldviews. Let's compare sort of ideologies of Canada's First Nations people with European Canadian people. So here we have North American First Nations holistic worldview. So we have live in peace and harmony for survival. That's part of the First Nations worldview. Cooperation is important. It brings group strength. Traditional territories are used for the benefit of the collective, right? Shared land and resources, which provide for the necessity of life. Individuals are given the choice to learn to live in respectful relationships, and each person is sacred and complete. Okay, so this last line here, could possibly fit with the principle of individualism, which is rights and freedoms. But the rest are very collectivist, right? They fit more with the principles of collectivism here on the left side of the ideological spectrum. And in many ways, many First Nations are very collectivist. Okay, I don't want to generalize too much, but I'm going to generalize a little bit in this lesson. In fact, I generalize a lot in a lot of my lessons, which is just sort of a necessity of teaching social studies. But typically speaking, um, we see a lot of principles of collectivism being embraced by First Nations. First Nations. Okay, and then we can contrast that with the European liberal worldview, which states that it's important to keep the peace, gain allies, to use those allies strategically. Acquiring land and resources is important, and that land makes up private property. Capitalism and competition are important parts of the European worldview historically. And change brings about progress, and it's important to act out of self-interest. So you can see that the European liberal worldview is far more individualist, it's more in line with liberalism. Okay, and the major difference between these two worldviews that we're going to focus on in today's lessons, in today's lesson, is highlighted by this First Nations elder. Okay, um, this elder spoke and said, when the Europeans first came, the people who spoke to them told them, you see that mountain over there? That's not ours to give you. The land we cannot give you because it's not ours to give. It belongs to the Creator. Those trees and the animals, we cannot give them to you. They're not ours to give. All right, so you can see this major difference that's highlighted in this quote is the concept of land ownership. Right, so we see that under First Nations worldviews, land is meant to be, here's the special word right here, shared, right? Land is shared amongst members of the community, right? And the land is used for the benefit of the entire collective and not just for the benefit of one specific person or one specific family. And that's very different from the European liberal worldview, which focuses more on self-interest and individualism, right? in which land is owned privately for the most part. In some cases, there's public property, but for the most part, it's owned privately. Okay, so let's contrast the Aboriginal relationship to land to European relationship to land. So, under Aboriginal relationship to land, people control and exercise stewardship over territory, right? The word stewardship, this is related to the idea of people being responsible for taking care of the land and making sure that the land remains healthy and capable of sustaining future generations. And the land doesn't belong to individual people. In fact, the land belongs to the creator. We would say the land belongs to God, right? And so God the creator, right? And in this case, land is given to the people, but it's only given to people so that they can care for it, you know, for a very, very long period of time, right? The idea is for communities to be sustainable in the Aboriginal relationship to land, to ensure that land can be passed down to future generations, right? And so the right to inhabit, right? So to live on the land and to live from the land is considered inalienable in Aboriginal worldviews. Okay, and so that means inalienable means it cannot be taken away. Okay, so your right to live in land cannot be taken away. Okay, now that's very different from the European relationship to land. Okay, in the European worldview, land is divided up and it's sold, right? It's owned either privately or publicly. In most cases, land is private property, owned by one person or a small group of people. In other cases, it can be public property, which serves um, the role of benefiting the collective. Okay, so you see that there's a pretty big difference between the relationships to land, and that's going to become very, very important throughout today's lesson, right? Because today's lesson talks about a lot of different things that happen in Canadian history that show that these two different groups of people who were all of a sudden living in the same continent had very different ideas about how land ownership works and how stewardship of the land works. Okay, so if you're using the partial notes, you'll see that the next box in your partial notes has a proclamation by the king, right? So that means that it is a royal proclamation, all right? This royal proclamation comes in 1763. So if you're using the partial notes, it's this section right here. There we go. All right. So the British government knew they needed to appease the First Nations and find a way to expand settlement without inciting resistance. So what am I talking about? Well, by 1763, uh, Europeans had made their way into, for the most part, they were just inhabiting the eastern portion of what is now Canada, right? There were not that many European settlers yet in the west of Canada, of what we now call Canada, right? And so the British government, which owned the colonies in eastern Canada, they wanted to expand, right? They wanted to get Europeans to start living in the west as well, not just in the east. And so, in order to do that, they knew that they needed to find a way to appease the indigenous people who were living in the west, right? And they wanted to be able to expand without there being any resistance from the indigenous people in the West. Okay, and so this royal proclamation was written, right? The word royal means it's coming from monarchy, right? From the royal family. So this royal proclamation, it clearly defined what is to be considered Indian territory. Today we would say First Nations territory, or we would say Indigenous territory or Aboriginal territory. But at the time they were using the word Indian to refer to Indigenous peoples. Okay, and so they defined what Indian territory was, and they also defined the rules for expanding European settlements into the territory that was inhabited by indigenous people. And so here are the rules. First of all, only one group of people is allowed to buy land from the First Nations, and that is the crown or representatives of the crown. And in this case, when we talk about the crown, we're talking about the king, right? The monarch, right? First Nations are separate and they are sovereign nations. So this word sovereign is a word that you guys learned in Social 20. To be a sovereign nation means that you are an independent nation. You are a nation that has control and power over its own territory and over its own decision making, right? And so the Royal Proclamation stated that First Nations are nations, right? That they have sovereignty and their sovereignty is to be respected, okay? And so treaties were meant to be signed between the Crown, right, the British Crown, and the leaders of First Nations. And those treaties are meant to be upheld according to the Royal Proclamation way back in 1763. Okay, so this was before Canada was even an independent country yet, right? This was like 100 years before Canada became an independent country. So at this time, uh, the Europeans that we're talking about here, these are people who are part of the British Empire, right? They are people who were living in the colonies of the British Empire. And these were the rules that were set out, that were laid out for all expansion into territory that the settlers were not yet living in, territory that First Nations people were, the majorities, territory on which First Nations people formed a majority. Okay, so now by 1812, European settlers had outnumbered Aboriginal peoples 10-1 in Eastern Canada, and many treaties had been signed in Western Canada. Okay, so in Western Canada, it was still, for the most part, First Nations people outnumbered Europeans, and treaties had been signed between the British monarchy and the leaders of First Nations. So treaties, you've heard this word treaty many times, I'm sure, in social studies classes. It's a written agreement between two different countries, two different nations. And so in this case, these are treaties that are signed between the British Crown and leaders of various First Nations. Pop quiz. Which treaty do we live in? Well, hopefully you know by now we live in Treaty 7, right? So Treaty 7 is right here, and it was signed in 1877, and it includes a variety of First Nations. Okay, so treaties, these were negotiated between Europeans and Aboriginal peoples to allow newcomers to claim the land Indigenous peoples inhabited at the time. Okay, and in these treaties, First Nations were promised certain things. They were promised compensation, right, which means that they would be given certain things uh, in exchange for their land. That included annual payments, right, payments of money every year, social and economic benefits, use of some land. So some land was reserved for the First Nations people, right? And so we now call that land reserves, right? And what was I going to say? These forms of compensation, they vary from treaty to treaty. So we live in Treaty 7. Compensation for First Nations people here in Treaty 7 is different from the compensation that is given to First Nations people north of us in Treaty 6, right? And different from Treaty 5 and Treaty 2 and all that. Okay, there are many issues that we see, many problems that we see with these treaties. The British did not trust oral agreements, right? So the First Nations people, they were used to oral agreements, right? Whereas the British, they were not used to oral agreements. They were used to having, written and signed treaties. Also, First Nations were not always governed by hierarchies, right? So a population didn't always follow a leader's decisions, right? Many First Nations, they didn't have the equivalent of, say, a king. Like European nations had a king and everyone would listen to the king, right? Otherwise they would get in serious trouble, right? Well, that wasn't always the case with First Nations. And so just because their chief might have signed a paper doesn't mean that everyone in the First Nation is necessarily going to, agree with what the king signed or with what the chief signed, or even have a tradition of following along with those things. Okay? And then there was a huge problem with language, right? As you saw earlier, many Aboriginal nations, they were not used to this idea of exclusive land ownership, right? And so in some cases, there were no words in the First Nation languages to even describe the concept of one group of people owning land and other groups of people not being allowed on that land, right? So the idea of like one person selling their land to another person was just, literally a foreign concept to them. And colonizing powers didn't always see First Nations as sovereign nations, and they didn't always respect the First Nations with whom they were signing these treaties. And so they didn't always treat these treaties as being valid international agreements like with other treaties that they would have signed with other European countries. And so 1867 is the year where Canada becomes an independent country, right? Where um, we elect this man right here to be our prime minister, John A. Macdonald. Okay. And so we form our own country in 1867. And while forming this independent country, well, you can see in the picture, you see a lot of European Canadians, right? A lot of white Canadians who are signing the papers, doing the deal so that Canada can become an independent country. Uh, First Nations people were not consulted on what kind of country they wanted Canada to become and what kinds of rights they should have, right? Instead, white Canadians were the leaders of white Canada. They came up with this plan on their own and they dealt with the British government while forming this new country. And so Canada's first prime minister, John A. Macdonald, is seen right here. And here is what he had to say after Canada became an independent nation, or independent country. Here's what he had to say about the First Nations people who were living in Canada at the time. He said the Canadian government will do away with First Nations governments and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the inhabitants of the Dominion. So here, when he talks about the inhabitants of the Dominion, he's talking about European Canadians. All right, so the goal here is to assimilate and to impose liberalism on First Nations people living in Canada. So first we have the Indian Act. All right, so you're going to see there is the Indian Act in your partial notes right here. So there's a spot for you to write the title, Indian Act 1876. Okay. So this was a law that was passed by the Canadian government in 1876, and it made Indians in the land reserved for Indians. Remember, this is the word that was used to refer to First Nations people back at that time. They became the responsibility of the government. Okay. But First Nations people were never consulted on whether they wanted to become the responsibility of the government. The Indian Act was developed out of the mistaken assumption that First Nations people were incapable of managing their own affairs, right? So European Canadians at the time, many of them at least, believed that First Nations people could not, run their own nations, that they were incapable of forming their own governments and making decisions for themselves. Instead, they had this paternalistic approach to dealing with First Nations, and they felt as if it was necessary to make decisions for them. In this document, the Indian Act governed the day-to-day life for First Nations people, right? So it did a lot of things. It banned Indigenous ceremonies. It regulated Indian status. Okay, so this is where we start seeing this term Indian status. So this is when a First Nations person has a special and distinct status within Canada. So that Indian status allows them to enjoy the compensation that we were talking about earlier from the treaties that were signed, right? But it also comes with many very, very strict limits, many restrictions to their rights and freedoms. which we'll talk about in today's lesson. It also imposed what was called the band system. So remember a minute ago when I said that John A. Macdonald wanted to do away with First Nations governments? Well, so First Nations had their own forms of government that they had been using for a very, very long time. And the Canadian government decided through the Indian Act that they were going to um, get rid of those traditional forms of government and replace those forms of government with this new form of government called Indian bands. And these new bands gave them a lot less power than their traditional forms of government. They implemented reserves and they enacted residential schools through the Indian Act. So you guys have learned about residential schools throughout junior high and also in social 10, right? And I think you know what the goal was of residential schools, right? The goal was to assimilate First Nations people, starting with their children, assimilating them into the European, Christian, Canadian culture, right? So overall, the goal of the Indian Act was assimilation, or uh, as we're going to, the term that we're using in this course is more so imposing liberalism, right? So that's what assimilation looks like, forcing upon First Nations people the principles of liberalism. So here was Duncan Campbell Scott. He was Superintendent of Indian Affairs, so he was a member of the Canadian government. And here's what he had to say about the First Nations people living in Canada at the time. He said, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic and there is no Indian question. Education is the forefront of their requirements now," right? And so we see the use of residential schools to assimilate First Nations children into European, Christian, Canadian culture. And so the goal, of course, is to take children from this and turn them into this, right? So this is the same child. And a photo was taken of this child before attending a residential school, and then another photo was taken after he attended residential school. And so you can see the goal is to impose liberalism, to impose this European ideology on the children of First Nations. Next, we have enfranchisement. Okay, so as you can see in this picture, enfranchisement has to do with voting. If you are given the right to vote, then you are enfranchised, right? If your right to vote is taken away, then you are disenfranchised. So here we have enfranchisement, which means if First Nations people wanted the right to vote, or if First Nations women married non-status men, so it means non-First Nations men, they would lose their Indian status. So while enfranchisement can seem like a good thing, on the surface, it can seem like, oh, okay, well, First Nations people were being given the right to vote. All right. Well, actually, that meant that if a First Nations person wanted to be able to vote, they would have to renounce their Indian status and they would have to renounce their treaty rights. And so they would have to give up their First Nations identity and give up their compensation that they were to receive through the treaties that were signed, right? And so this can very well be seen as an attempt to assimilate and to impose liberalism on First Nations people, right? Instead of giving them the right to vote, without them having to give up their Indian status and treaty rights, right? So this didn't actually change for a very, very long time. As you guys learned back in Unit 2A, right? Remember when you guys took a look at this chart right here, you learned that it wasn't until 1960 that First Nations people were allowed to vote without surrendering their status as First Nations, without losing their Indian status. Okay, so these enfranchisement laws existed for a very, very long time until quite recently. So, do you recognize this guy? Does he look like somebody that you know? Well, he is the father of our current prime minister, right? So this guy was Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. So the prime minister that we have today, Justin Trudeau, his dad was also prime minister. He was prime minister a long, long time ago. All right. So um, Pierre Trudeau, he had this vision that he articulated for Canada. He wanted Canada to be a pluralist society, right? So a multicultural society. He wanted cohesiveness, right? So he wanted different ethnic groups of Canada to to fit with each other, to get along with each other, and for all ethnic groups in Canada to have a sense of belonging in Canada. And so he proposed this plan called the White Paper, right? So you can write that down as the title for this section. The White Paper was proposed back in 1969, and it was a paper, it was like a list of proposals of changes that he wanted to take place for First Nations people in Canada. And that included abolishing the treaties, right? So getting rid of the treaties that were signed, abolishing all reserves, so not reserving specific land for First Nations people anymore, and getting rid of the Indian status of all First Nations people. Okay. And so he spoke about wanting to get Indigenous people of Canada to catch up with the rest of Canada, right? So there was, and there still is today, but at the time it was clear that there was uh, a really big division in terms of wealth and education, literacy rates, and life expectancy, and many health indicators between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, right? And so what was proposed by Trudeau's government was to essentially get rid of everything about First Nations people that makes them different than the rest of Canadians, right? To abolish the treaties, get rid of the reserves, remove anything that has to do with Indian status, and to essentially remove everything about them that makes them distinct and different, right? And so that was proposed in the white paper. Okay, so now we have looked at three different things. We've looked at the Indian Act, the enfranchisement, and the white paper. If you could sort of somehow label these three things by, I don't know, draw a little arrow to them or circle them or something, and label them all as being attempts to assimilate or attempts to impose liberalism on First Nations here in Canada. Okay, because that's what they were, right? These are all different examples of ways in which the government has attempted to impose liberalism or to assimilate Canada's First Nations people. Okay, so we're still talking about the white paper, and there was a lot of opposition to this white paper from First Nations leaders here in Canada. And one man who really stood out as as a leader during this time was Harold Cardinal. And so Cardinal was a Cree man, and he was a lawyer, an activist, and he was, like one of the prominent speakers of the opposition to the white paper, right? And so he and others pointed out many problems that they had with the white paper. First of all, they were not consulted when the white paper was being written out, right? So here Trudeau was about to make a very, very big uh, change in the lives of First Nations people, and they were asking, well, why would you not talk to us about it first, right? Why not consult with us and with our leaders so that we can come up with a plan that works for us, right? Um, and also with this plan, they pointed out that First Nations don't gain anything, but they have to give up a lot, right? They give up their reserves, they give up their treaty rights, they give up their Indian status, right? And so what do they gain, right? But they're losing a lot, according to First Nations leaders. And this was seen among First Nations leaders as another attempt to assimilate them and to impose liberalism on them. And so uh, Indigenous leaders, including Harold Cardinal, uh, they proposed something else called Citizens Plus, which came to be known as the Red Paper. All right, and so often people know it as the Red Paper instead of Citizens Plus. And it outlined their objections to the white paper, right? The problems that they had with the white, right? They said, well, first of all treaty rights should be respected, right? So the British Crown signed these treaties, and the Canadian people should respect them, right? And First Nations themselves should have the right to determine their own priorities, right? This is called self-determination, where um, First Nations, being considered sovereign and respected nations, should have the right to a certain amount of autonomy and independence and be allowed to make choices for themselves instead of having decisions imposed on them by uh, by the Canadian government, right? And they believe that reserve land belongs to First Nations and that the Canadian government doesn't have the right to say all of a sudden, actually that land doesn't belong to you anymore. We're going to take that away. First Nations said no. This was promised to us. This reserve land belongs to us. Okay, so in the end, there ended up being no white paper. The federal government withdrew the white paper, and they moved on to other concerns. As the Canadian government had a lot of other things to focus on instead, they decided that they were not going to pursue the white paper after all. Okay, so in this lesson, you saw a variety of attempts to assimilate and impose liberalism on First Nations people. That is your lesson 4. Okay, so that's that. There will be some stuff coming out pretty soon here to talk about what we're going to do for the Unit 2B uh, tests. Okay, so stay tuned and have a great day.